Gorbachev certainly thought that communism could work. He wanted to clean it up a bit. He wanted to have higher production standards and qualities. So there was even a kind of almost quasi-prohibition. He wanted people to drink less. He wanted to get rid of the corruption, which, frankly, was part of what allowed the system to work at all. I think that's the part he really didn't understand. The regime he was running was not really popular. In the end, it rested on force.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It is the spring of 1989, Beijing, Tiananmen Square, a gathering of students that grows over several weeks, anticipating and then observing the visit of the leader of the Soviet Union, a man named Gorbachev, making a call on the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing, the CCP itself, led by a man named Deng Xiaoping. That meeting is a world-scale event. Events in Europe have been changing the direction of communism, Marxist-Leninism, and the TV cameras are invited into Beijing during that period of conversation, in some fashion an alliance of two communist states that are changing their ways. Deng Xiaoping is seen as a reformer. Mikhail Gorbachev is seen as a reformer. And gathering in the square are also TV reporters and radio reporters from around the world. In other words, all attention. And then there's the death of a man named Hu Yaobang. His death leads to outpouring of sympathy across the nation because he was seen as a reformer or a lighter hand of the brutality that the people of China have visited. This event does not begin, but it ends. A new book, To Overthrow the World, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Communism. I welcome Professor Sean McMeekin. He's done an enormous amount of work putting this all together. And because I've read pieces of this over the years in individual books, it is a great insight to put it all together and to make you read it continuously. Not only at Tiananmen Square, which is still banned, or any reference to Tiananmen Square is banned, or throughout the world, as far as I can see, that has any presence of the Chinese Communist Party whatsoever. But Tiananmen is what Marxist Leninism, communism, Maoism has not explained. What does Tiananmen mean, the massacre that happened on the night of June 4th, 1989? Professor, a very good evening to you. Thank you for this. I congratulate you enormously on this work. What does Tiananmen mean now to those who were once communists in Russia and those who claim to be Maoist communists in China? Do they speak of it anywhere, or is it completely banished from their memories? Good evening to you.
Well, thank you for having me on, John. It's great to be back on the air with you again. What does Tiananmen mean? I suppose Chinese dissidents certainly know what it means. I think in China, as you suggest, it's really not spoken of at all. What it means is the same thing, I suppose, that Kronstadt used to mean in interwar Europe when people were talking about the true legacy of communism. That is a government basically firing into the crowds. And in the case of Kronstadt, not entirely unlike Tiananmen, you had the government killing a lot of the people that it ostensibly, of course, was serving. The case of Kronstadt, it was more a matter of working classes, factory workers, some sailors, some soldiers. In the case of Tiananmen Square, I suppose it was perhaps a bit more prominently constituted of students. But they were certainly proletarians in you might say, in the imagery or the mythology of the regime. The masses were there, supposedly calling for some variety of democracy, some variety of people's rule, which of course communist parties claimed to do some variety of. It was either people's democracy or it was rule in the name of the people, or at least the proletarians, or a dictatorship of the proletariat. Effectively, Tiananmen is the tearing off of the mask. You can't really pretend after Tiananmen Square that the regime exists on any basis of popular sovereignty, on any basis of the consent of the governed to its rule. You have the unmasking, of course, of raw force, of brutality, of political violence, which really is at the essence of the communist project.
Karl Marx, born 1918, died 1883. Go back to the beginning of this idea of communism because It's the Communist Manifesto that becomes part of the conversation over these century and a half that communism has been first avant-garde, then trendy, then persuasive, and then brutality and mystery. Karl Marx was born in Prussia, so he's born a Prussian. He comes from a family that does not practice its Judaism. He early on, I'm following Sean's reporting, University of Bonn, University of Berlin, University of Vienna. He early on reads Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Saint-Simon, Fourier, the French socialists, and he moves from Germany to Cologne to Paris, and in the course of his life, he'll eventually live in London. But Karl Marx was a Hegelian, and it's important to understand that when you get phrases that are persuasive, I learned from Sean, such as about the proletariat, or the world is divided between the oppressors and the oppressed. That's Hegelianism. What did it mean to Karl Marx? How did he interpret Hegel, the great German philosopher, that was useful for him in creating the Communist Manifesto and then also writing Das Kapital?
Well, from Hegel, Marx, like a lot of the so-called left Hegelians, there were some who were more the center on the right, but the left Hegelians drew from Hegel the idea of history as the product of this incessant struggle, a kind of binary struggle. In Hegel's vision, it was about progression towards some final, perhaps almost something like a Fukuyama, that is, with progress towards the modern nation state with secular values, but overlain with a kind of Christian morality, which helped to keep everyone, to some extent, on a moral plane. He basically thought things were getting better. He was something of an optimist, that the world might end in some variety of what might later be called Western liberal democracy. The left Hegelians were a bit darker, or perhaps you might say more cynical. They did see history as the process of struggle, of opposition, in the old phrase, thesis against antithesis forming a synthesis. This is the essence of the dialectic, as the Marxists would later call it. History is the course of these struggles. Marx tried to reduce it to a binary struggle, which he called class struggle. He could never quite simplify it that far. If you actually read his writings, there are all kinds of different classes, but ultimately he wants them all to melt together into these two. You have oppressors and oppressed. You have the capitalists and the proletariat, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Inevitably, history is supposed to be simplified into this kind of binary dialectical cataclysm. But the way Marx is actually describing it, what's interesting is, of course, although he is reading a little bit of history and eventually he does study a bit of economics, he really is predominantly a philosopher. So that for him, it's something like it's almost like a word game. It's an abstract word game. At one point, he actually defines communism as the negation of the negation. That is, he's trying to solve this puzzle that Hegel posed for his students, the riddle of history solved, trying to figure out the ultimate process that could explain everything, the kind of theory of history. And so Marx came up with this theory, basically, that history was all produced by class struggle. So supposedly since the French Revolution, everything had been reduced. You no longer had the feudal period. You no longer had the varieties of hierarchy and aristocracy and monarchy, but eventually you would just have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And when he outlined this in the Manifesto of the Communist Party in 1848, he also predicted or produced, it's a little bit more advocacy, I think, than it is prophecy, although it's meant to be prophecy, the idea that eventually you would get this final cataclysm and the workers of the world would unite, as the phrase would have it, realize that they all shared the same oppressor, that all the various other identities, national identities, ethnic identities, class, or even family, of course, would be basically dissolved in this struggle into the final binary cataclysmic clash between capital and the proletariat, or the bourgeois and the proletariat. So he's really getting this from philosophy. Eventually he does decorate his account with bits and pieces that he picked up from reading the history, particularly of the French Revolution. Later on, when he was in England, he would decorate it with various data when he was writing Das Kapital, which is meant to be almost like a work of economic theory or economic history. But it really is ultimately a philosophical project, so that in the end, Marx is something of a word wordsmith. He's very good with words. So he would come up with these phrases. The integument of private property bursts asunder. The expropriators are expropriated. These very, very striking phrases. Workers of the world unite. Workers have no homeland. They're very striking. They're very memorable. Eventually, they produce almost a kind of a rhythmic catechism. But in the end, I think it's really far more philosophy than it really is any type of serious political economy.
Sean McMeekin, Professor Sean McMeekin, the new book is To Overthrow the World, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Communism. The professor has done us the favor of putting together in a continual narrative how the idea of communism, the Communist Manifesto, penned by Karl Marx with Friedrich Engels, his co-pilot, how that has influenced different cultures where it never was native. Traveled that book, those phrases have traveled around the world and continue to reverberate. But I learned from the professor that communism, Marxist-Leninism, or just Marxism, prospers only in conjunction with extreme violence. As the professor says again and again, no communist dictatorship has ever come to power through the ballot box. It's extreme violence and the disintegration of norms, that's the modern word we're using, around the governance that creates conditions for this fiction of the dictatorship, let's say the old-fashioned way, conspiracy of equals. We need to touch on a man named Babeuf. Gracchus Babeuf was his nom de guerre, a Frenchman who was executed for being a troublemaker. What do we need to know about Babeuf that is inspirational to those who come across his final speech? I believe it was in a courtroom.
Well, that's right. Now, Babeuf was drawing on certain ideas common in the French Enlightenment, but not necessarily the ones that we're most familiar with today. A lot of people have read Rousseau, and they might have discussed the ideas in the social contract about this idealized Republican community where there is a kind of binary opposition between those inside and outside the community, the idea of the general will, the idea almost of, to some extent, of a state being able to label those outside the circle of loyalties, enemies of the people. But someone who was writing at the same time as Rousseau, a little bit less well-known, Etienne Morley, penned an even more extreme work, which was far more literal-minded in its advocacy of what we later call communism. And in fact, this work, unlike Rousseau, was a staple of the Marxist-Leninist canon in the Eastern Bloc countries and the Soviet Union. And Babeuf was drawing on this work, which actually was quite explicit in advocating not just a kind of idealized radical Republican political community, but also the overturning of private property and ultimately even the centralization, the storage of everything from grain and foodstuffs to the things that people need for daily life in some type of central storehouse where it all be rationed out amongst the people. So Babeuf is drawing on a very radical strain from the French Enlightenment, and then in turn, of course, he's also helping to set this new ideal or example, not least because although he failed, he was executed for the various capital crimes involved in the so-called conspiracy of the equals when they actually did try to overthrow the French government and overturn private property. And there were also elements of this, which you were going to see in a lot of future communist actions, uprisings, putsches, revolutions, which involved mutinies. That is, they were trying to promote mutinies in the armed forces. In this case, it was really more the police and the armed forces, because the armed forces were a little bit less crucial, at least in Babeuf's plans. But the idea is he knew that he would need armed muscle. He knew he would need to convert those from inside the police to basically support the revolution from the inside. And he was quite open about the fact that this required cleansing political violence. There was a lot of talk of these people being unmasked effectively as class enemies. Basically, anyone who would oppose the revolution would unmask themselves as a class enemy and apologists for the capitalist ruling classes, and they would have to then be, of course, crushed and destroyed and exterminated. So although Babeuf failed, he established a precedent. He established an example. And he also had some luck and fortune, not just in his own skill for public relations, but one of his co-conspirators who was spared execution, Philippe Buonarroti, later wrote a kind of heroic insider history of the conspiracy of the equals, which came out right after the French Revolution of 1830, so it helped to popularize the ideas. And so the legend of Babeuf, the conspiracy of the equals, then helped in turn to inspire Marx. And I think Marx drew from it not just some of the specific ideas about the abolition of private property and state control of the economy and planning and those kinds of things, but also the importance, really, the centrality of political violence to the project.
The communards, March of 1871 to May of 1871, suppressed violently. Men and women and children died in the hands of the retaking of Paris. Marx had nothing to do with the Commune. He wasn't in Paris at the time. He was in London. And yet he adopted it. Why? Why did he present himself as if he'd inspired the Commune?
Well, it's a great question, John. So, a lot of Marx's apologists have often said that Marx can't be blamed for the various excesses and crimes against humanity committed by the regimes inspired by him in the 20th century because, well, he wasn't there, he wasn't alive, and who knows what he would have thought. The closest that the world came to any type of communist revolution during Marx's lifetime was undoubtedly the Paris Commune of 1871. And you're absolutely right that Marx played very little role in either inspiring or organizing it. He, of course, wasn't there, he wasn't on the ground. Although he led this organization called the First Working Man's International Association, which was blamed by the French government, and this is in the midst of a chaotic war with Prussia, the Franco-Prussian War. Marx's organization was blamed in a kind of general sense for having inspired the uprising, even though that wasn't really true. Marx could very well have dissociated himself from it. He could have disowned the Paris Commune, which he pretty much knew was going to go down in a blaze of violence as soon as the Prussian army and the French Republican forces just kind of worked out a settlement who was going to basically restore order in Paris. He was offered the opportunity. He certainly could have distanced himself from it, but instead he went the other way. He embraced it even as it was going down in this kind of blaze of violence, even as the communards were taking dozens of bourgeois hostages, including the Archbishop of Paris, and there was this kind of almost orgy of violence where they were throwing women and children into the battle. Far from disowning any of that, Marx embraced it all and said this was proof of its veracity, proof of its sincerity. That is, to have a true communist revolution, you had to kill class enemies, and women and children would have to be thrown into the battle.
30 seconds. Go ahead.
So Marx made it perfectly clear that even if this revolution might not have been perfect, it was still going to set an example for the future precisely because it was both radical and extremely violent. So the political violence was central to the project.
We're headed to the 20th century. To overthrow the world, the rise and fall and rise of communism. Professor Sean McMeekin is the author. Now the man himself, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, the son of school teachers and principals, a man who has a very colorful 54 years, I believe, born in 1870, died in 1924 after a series of strokes. How did he come to be a Marxist? What is it that compelled him? Probably the family story, but also the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital were published in Russian and were very large successes, especially Das Kapital. The manifesto I have, Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, he calls himself Lenin. His name is Ulyanov, but he takes up a nom de guerre during his publishing of something called the Iskra, the spark. He reads it for the first time and adopts it in 89. What about the manifesto that appealed to him? Was it the leveling? Was it the transformation of all that is into something new? Did he have some magical connection to it, Professor?
Well, I think Lenin was certainly inspired by the overall vision, the radicalism of it, but particularly I think the aspect of it which did require political violence, something that Lenin was always quite adamant about advocating himself. To the extent Lenin updated Marx's ideas, and one can see that as early as Что делать, or What is to be Done, published in 1902, which was really a manual of revolutionary tactics, sometimes called vanguardism. Lenin's idea that you had this top-down party that, because the workers weren't really doing it themselves or figuring out the doctrine, you had to have these professional revolutionaries, these intellectuals, these cadres who would do it for them. Lenin's other, I think, real innovation came during the First World War. But again, it was partly from his study of not just Marx's works, but also Marx's life and his example. For example, the Franco-Prussian War and the Paris Commune, which we talked about. Lenin drew from this the idea that if two countries went to war, perhaps more than two, that war, the cataclysm, but also particularly the possibility that one side would have to lose, and that side would be discredited, its regime, its whole ruling classes would be discredited. That would create the opportunity for revolution, such as happened with the French in the Paris Commune. And you saw this happen again in Russia during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, which produced a kind of political revolution in Russia, although it didn't go as far as he would have liked. So during the First World War, he worked this out, and he called the idea revolutionary defeatism. It actually went beyond simply this idea that you could use the war and the loss of one country in that war as a springboard to revolution, or as the phrase went, turn the imperialist war into civil war. Lenin actually outlined this quite explicitly in a work called the Military Program of the Proletarian Revolution. And what Lenin foresaw, and here's where you could see, I think, where he really was inspired by the violent nature of Marx's vision, that Lenin thought, following Marx, that this cataclysm, the imperialist wars, he called the First World War, would produce basically a revolution, whatever the weakest link in the chain was, which he hoped would be Russia, that Russia would lose, and that's where the revolution would start. But that's not where it would end. The imperialist war would first turn into a civil war in Russia, and then once the communists took power there, they would then be in a state of kind of undeclared or perhaps declared war with the rest of the world, with the outside world, the capitalist world, so that in the end, the imperialist war would beget a civil war, which in turn would beget a whole series of wars between that new proletarian dictatorship or communist country and all the non-communist countries. So you'd have this state of perennial global civil war, and you'd have a whole kind of series of civil wars erupting all over the world until you would finally usher in the great proletarian revolution. So that he was taking Marx's ideas in the same direction, but a little bit further. And to the extent I think he understood something maybe Marx hadn't quite understood in Das Kapital, that in the end, the more likely catalyst for communist revolution was actually war between the capitalist powers, between the capitalist states. This was also what he called imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, that the cataclysm, when the integument of private property would supposedly burst asunder, that what would actually happen was you'd get a kind of global imperialist war. This war would then beget more wars, civil wars, basically ad nauseum, until the whole world would be engulfed in this kind of flame of revolutionary violence and civil war. And mind you, he was not saying that he hoped this wouldn't happen. He was saying this is exactly what he wanted to happen. He was advocating this as a kind of ideal scenario, that the world would erupt in a series of ever bloodier, ever more cataclysmic civil wars. And this is how the communists would come to power.
There are other voices. Some call themselves socialists, some call themselves Mensheviks, some call themselves anarchists. And there's another theory of the transformation of the bourgeois, of the middle class, of what exists, the status quo, into the future, and that is immiseration. There seems to be a tension, Professor, between revolutionary defeatism and immiseration. How was that resolved?
Well, so the immiseration thesis, or Verelendung, as the German word had it, this was Marx's idea, expressed most, I suppose, thoroughly in Das Kapital, that all of the workers everywhere in the world, maybe they didn't start off as industrial proletarians, they might have been in other classes or professions or artisans. Eventually, they would all be kind of melted together into this universal proletarian class, ever more miserable, ever poor, that wages would keep declining according to a version of Ricardo's own iron law of wages, though Marx didn't actually attribute it to Ricardo, but it was a similar idea, but taken in an even more extreme direction, that eventually everyone would be equally poor and miserable until, I suppose, some magical moment would happen and the communists or the proletarians would rise up and overthrow the classes. The anarchists had a very different idea. It wasn't nearly as systematic. It was more that they would just strike these symbolic blows here and there, acts of rebellion or political violence or political assassination or perhaps kind of theft or wildcat strikes. They never really quite worked out what the future society would look like. They were just skeptical about the Marxist vision, as Bakunin, one of Marx's rivals, a Russian anarchist, had pointed out, and I think he was quite prophetic about this. In the end, if you wanted to have state control of the economy, the abolition of private property, and state control of all economic activity, that would require, of course, an infinitely powerful state, a kind of state tyranny. And the anarchists didn't like that. they weren't quite sure what would replace it. There were a lot of other socialists, I suppose, who wanted to kind of have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to have some variety of a greater government role in the economy, some variety of a larger voice for the workers in elections, in parliament, in organizing a political system, but they didn't want to necessarily embrace the political violence. And so you might say they lacked the courage of their convictions in the way that the Bolsheviks did, whether it was the Mensheviks in Russia or some of the social democrats in Europe, who in the end rejected communism. Believe it or not, they actually had their own organization in the interwar years in the 20s and 30s, referred to in shorthand as, whereas Lenin's was the third international following the first under Marx, the second which had blown up in 1914 at the outbreak of the First World War. Theirs was the second and a half international. It was kind of, they did believe in solidarity, but they shied away from the violence and from the more extreme vision of the communists, that is, in not just kind of directing violence domestically, but also in preparing for a global revolutionary cataclysm. So a lot of socialists shied away from that aspect of the communist project.
The professor's book allows us to concentrate on the ideas, the conversations, the dialogue, the debates, the arguments, the anger, and not just on the individual personalities. Although they're compelling, they come to the brutes and the mass murderers and the victims. But the ideas pass from generation to generation. Marx is an older generation who only knows his Prussian background. Ulyanov, Lenin, is a newer generation who understands provincial Russia and understands Russia entirely, but he travels in Europe. And I'm struck by his travels and what he learned from traveling in Europe. He was in Krakow, and I just so happens I've been in Krakow a couple of times in my life. It has a wonderful university. It's a very cultured city. It was never destroyed in the wars of the 20th century. Did he learn from the societies he lived in exile? Or was he indifferent? Did he close the door and shut his ears?
I think Lenin mostly shut his ears. He might have picked up a bit of a Germanic sensibility because he spent so much time among German speakers. I certainly don't think he picked up any of the ethereal beauty of Krakow. I mean, one of the things Lenin allegedly said was when he was younger and perhaps a little bit less devoted to his political project, his political vision, he used to listen to music and pay more attention to the world around him. But eventually he had to stop listening to music because it would just make him sentimental. It would want to make a pet, I think, the heads of small animals and small children. No, in the end, I think he was just beset and bedeviled by this political vision. One would certainly hope that he had been more, I think, influenced by the world around him. But I think in the end, it was really mostly his books and his tracts and his ideas that drove him.
We moved to two lieutenants of Vladimir Lenin, Ulyanov. You know them both as killers, but they're also thinkers, especially Stalin, who had an enormous library and was proud of it. The book is To Overthrow the World, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Communism. Sean McMeekin is the author. Lenin dies in 1924 after a series of strokes. Joseph Stalin, real name Jashvili, he's a peasant family out of what is now Georgia, Barry, Georgia. He comes to power because he's the man, the managing editor of the Politburo. You go to him to get hired, and once Lenin is gone, Ulyanov is dead, he asserts control and eventually will take complete command of the Soviet Union after 1928, and he imposes a 5-year plan that leads to starvation and failure. However, he's a very strong voice in the world scale eventually. He sends out his spies everywhere, including the United States, and Sean notes especially the intellectual property theft that was part of the mission that Stalin sent his spies to the U.S. to steal every airplane factory plan they can find. That was the building of the Soviet Union. It's surprising how we see the same complaint about the building of the People's Republic of China. However, what we need to know about Stalin is what he made of Leninism and Leninist Marxism or Marxist Leninism. They reversed it back and forth. And was there such a thing as Stalinism? Because the other man that Sean writes about is a man named, we call him Trotsky, who is much more involved early on, the revolution of 1905, revolution of 1917, and builds the Red Army that becomes the master of the Eurasian continent. These two men were in tension from the first. Was it an ideological tension, Sean, or did they just hate each other?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. Although Trotsky was far more consistent in his ideological vision, effectively the best way to summarize it is just kind of revolution now and forever. He's always on the offensive. He always wants the revolution to be pursued, not just in Russia but around the world. He didn't want the communists to back down. Lenin's so-called new economic policy, where they gave up on a lot of the ideals of state control of the economy. Trotsky didn't like that. Stalin was willing to try it out. Stalin was in general a little bit more ideologically flexible, you might say. He was willing to try different things. He was not quite as consistent or wedded to any one thing. Certainly because Trotsky was a bit more flamboyant, was a greater orator, a bit more of a public figure. Some people have posited that Stalin might have had a streak of jealousy, and there may be something to that. Stalin, I think, was a far more savvy political operator. But in the end, I think the idea that Stalin was just a cynic, that he was just an opportunist, I think we also need to dismiss with that notion. He was very much a serious Marxist. It's just, as I said, he was a little bit more flexible in the same way that both really Marx and Lenin were, that they were able to adapt to circumstances and to bring unfolding events into dialectical materialism and come to the right conclusions about them. He wasn't hamstrung, you might say, by preconceived ideological ideas in the way that maybe Trotsky was a bit more single-minded, that he always seemed to think that the revolution had to move forward and it shouldn't really be beset by these retreats like the kind that Lenin had allowed with the new Lenin's phrase about the new economic policy was 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Stalin was willing to take 1 step back, whereas Trotsky really wasn't, and that's part of the reason why I think Stalin was able to isolate and destroy Trotsky. He just was so inflexible and stubborn, and he also just was not as savvy a political operator when it came to the inner workings of the bureaucracy.
Extreme violence is the predicate for communism to flourish. And extreme violence becomes under Stalin and Trotsky, but then again, exclusively Stalin, practiced within the party. And this is something that I do not read in Marx, I do not find in Lenin. The purge, it becomes the great purge of the 1930s, but Stalin was purging well before that. Is this something Russian, Sean? Because it's not in Prussia to shoot your commanders.
Well, there was certainly an element of political violence even under Trotsky, with the way that you would have deserters shot, for example, in concentration camps erected for deserters, or in Lenin's case, obviously enemies of the people, the so-called Red Terror. You're absolutely right that the terror under Stalin is kind of a different phenomenon, in that so much of it was directed at members of the Communist Party, the secret police, the upper ranks of the party bureaucracy, and eventually, of course, the army and the officer corps of the army, really in the highest ranks, including many field marshals. This was something a bit new. A lot of people have posited that Stalin might have even learned from Hitler in the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, when Hitler went after the truest of the true believers, and there may be something to that. Stalin obviously was also just something of a paranoid personality, and the paranoia was not completely irrational. There obviously was a lot of potential opposition in the regime, and so I suppose part of what he was trying to do is to cut that out from under him. A lot of Lenin's old comrades, the old Bolsheviks, as they're often called, people like Radek and Kamenev and Zinoviev, and even Bukharin, theorist of the new economic policy, a lot of these people were seen as potential threats because they had a certain seniority in the movement. Maybe they could have claimed even a kind of a senior position to Stalin. But in the end, I don't think anyone really knows for sure what motivated Stalin and so many of his henchmen. So many of them had blood in their hands, and once they had blood in their hands, there was essentially nothing stopping them. I mean, there was this process of radicalization, I think, that took a hold of so many of these leaders who were then obviously terrified themselves, and so they began to think that others might have been plotting against them. Some of it was a bit more prosaic, though. The international atmosphere in the 30s and fears of invasion were definitely part of it. You had xenophobia, you had a lot of alleged foreign spies. Trotsky had not been killed until 1940, and so the idea was there were Trotskyist cells or Trotskyist cells. We don't necessarily need to take the rhetoric at face value to realize that I think there was a level of paranoia in the Kremlin, both in the mind of Stalin and the mind of many of his other top officials. And of course, once people like Stalin and Beria and Yezhov have so much blood on their hands, they have a genuine fear that other people might hold them responsible for all the crimes that they committed. So I think you're right. It's hard to see this precisely in Marx, aside from the fact that there's a certain logic, I think, to these totalitarian regimes. First of all, they tend to get more radical over time, and second of all, they tend to look for scapegoats because the vision they keep promising to the people about building this new communist paradise, they keep falling short of this. They keep meeting or failing to meet industrial targets. They keep failing to produce the prosperity and the freedom that they're promising to deliver to the people, and so someone has to be blamed. So you have saboteurs and wreckers and all kinds of other categories of people who are scapegoated for the obvious failures of the regime.
And we just have a minute here, and having Trotsky murdered in Mexico in 1940, was that something that Stalin intended to do always, to wipe him out? Because he was so useful it's like a Orwellian, if you don't do what I say, East Asia's coming. So after Trotsky was dead, it seems that Stalin had lost his Antichrist.
That may be true. We do conventionally date the Great Terror as coming to a close sometime around 1939 or 40, and that used to be the general view. So with the assassination of Trotsky, it kind of wrapped something of a neat bow on the thing. But in fact, of course, if you actually look at the figures, the political arrests and the executions and the sending of people to the forced labor camps of the Gulag didn't really stop in 1940. So useful as Trotsky was, I don't think without Trotsky, Stalin was lacking for potential villains or scapegoats for alleged crimes. In many ways, the regime of the terror, particularly after the Nazi invasion, even ramped up even higher, because then you could have those who were potentially aiding the invader or in any other way invading some type of outside power for nefarious purposes.
Professor Sean McMeekin, his new book, To Overthrow the World, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Communism. Karl Marx is a Prussian, a European. Vladimir Lenin is a Russian, a European. Mao Zedong is neither. He is a man who comes from the peasant, pigtail-wearing Chinese born in 1893, so much younger than the older revolutionary communists that we've been watching in Europe. However, he is radicalized as a student, especially something called the May 4th of 1919, I believe, in reaction to what was considered to be a sellout of China at the Versailles Treaty. That is not his Marxism, however. He comes to Marxist-Leninism later on, reading the Communist Manifesto, reading what he can of Marx. However, Professor, again, congratulations for this. In reading the Europeans and their struggle with Marx when he was obtuse and when he was rhetorical. Marx is a great writer. He would have been successful in Hollywood for making up titles and easy ways to explain motion pictures. However, I'm struck by the fact that Mao Zedong and his followers were not Marxists. What were they? How did they regard Marx's writings that was supposed to be the genesis of their revolution?
Well, I think the key to understanding some of the differences of Marxism and later communism in Asia is that in some ways it's agglomerative. You're taking some of what you had in Europe already, ideas about this kind of binary struggle between oppressor and oppressed, but it's blended together with this very sharp anti-imperialism, because of course this is a country which is not in Europe, a country which had been prey to a lot of exploitation. I mean, let's be honest, by the European powers, going back to the Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion. So that Mao's not the only one. Of course, you have Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, who also have this kind of, even though they would later embrace a lot of foreign aid and foreign help, in the same way Mao, of course, would accept help from Soviet Russia, they still have this political rhetoric about trying to overturn or overthrow or liberate the country from foreign influence and foreign rule. So there's a real xenophobic element, I think, to Chinese communism. And I think this explains a lot of both the particular radicalism or the directions that it took in China. So that you can see that in everything from the kind of anti-American campaign during the Korean War to, you might say, kind of the heights of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution with this almost phantasmagorical xenophobia and targeting of foreigners and foreign influences and foreign fashions and foreign music and all kinds of foreign elements. So that here you don't just have the idea of capitalist oppressors and oppressed, maybe a more strictly Marxist vision. Rather, the idea is that the kind of the Chinese masses, the peasants, the poor of China are oppressed by this global imperialistic system, so that you want to eradicate and wipe out all elements of that in China. And some of this was actually eased along by the fact that, of course, as Mao and the Red Army were conquering China, so many of the foreigners, along with, of course, a lot of Chinese merchants and business owners and traders and intellectuals actually did flee. And so there was this element then of not just a class war, but this phrase, Hesperophobia, I've always thought was quite useful, the idea of almost a fear and loathing of the West. Partly an inferiority complex. Part of it was, I think, a genuine resentment, a ressentiment in the French phrase. And part of it was, I think, just this visceral, glowing hatred. And it really wasn't, unfortunately, that hard to mobilize people behind this vision. Again, a kind of a mixture of the same type of class envy that you might have felt, in a more traditional kind of a Marxist framework, along with this vicious kind of xenophobia.
I note you're reporting that Mao was reading before Marx, Adam Smith, Rousseau, Darwin, and Huxley. What a strange group, except for the fact that that's educated reading, and yet he took the revolutionary bend that you can get out of Leninism, not Marxist, but the Leninism part. So was it the violence that attracted him? Can we tell now?
I think the violence was definitely a huge part of the appeal. I mean, Mao's personality was definitely more eccentric, and I think, as you're pointing out, his reading was a little bit more eccentric and perhaps inconsistent as well. It's not that he wasn't dogmatic, it's just that his varieties of dogma were a little bit stranger and more eccentric, and his personality was also kind of larger and louder in a lot of ways. A lot of people have compared some of the grandiose spectacles that you would see in Maoist China, everything from these colossal book burnings to Mao's public swimming feats that would be kind of trumpeted to the media. There was an element almost of a kind of a Hitlerian or Mussolini style fascism or Nazism just in the public display of it, and of course in the personality cult. But a lot of it was, I think, more directly inspired. Certainly when you had these figures like Chen Boda, who was present in the 30s during the Stalin purges, and they come back and they conduct certain purges. I think you have to say that Mao was kind of ecumenical in borrowing various elements from the different strains of political thought, the different strains of tyrannical political traditions in Europe, and trying them all out and kind of just seeing what would stick. But I think in the end, yes, if there was a central glue, it was some variety of this kind of inferiority complex, the class envy, and also, I think, the xenophobia, I think that really explains a lot of what was particular and peculiar about the Chinese communist tradition under Mao.
The extreme violence of the Second War leads to the ability of the Chinese communists who have been driven into the provinces by fate and the Japanese, and there's the challenge of the Chiang Kai-shek Nationalist Army. The extreme violence brings them back into power, and the Red Army sweeps over the country, and the People's Republic of China is founded in the late 1940s. I want to go to how Mao used this power to stay in power, because he's aware of how Stalin runs his organization. Stalin treats him very badly when Mao is beckoned to Moscow at one point and kept cooling his heels for weeks while Stalin deliberately doesn't send to him. It's meant to be humiliating. The Soviets were always condescending towards everyone around them, but especially the Chinese. However, once Stalin is gone, 1953, and the triumvirate, eventually just Khrushchev, take controls, Mao is on his own to experiment. And now we have the Great Leap Forward, which leads to a vast famine, millions dead, unknown millions. And Mao blames anybody but himself, blames his own Politburo. And where is the thinking in this, Professor? Because it looked very much like Mao just experimenting with some ideas, but I don't know where he got them from. To starve people to death is communism?
Well, he seems to have gotten them from the Stalin period of collectivization in the early 1930s. I mean, if you believe Khrushchev, for example, who actually rebuked Mao for this and basically said there's no reason for you to be repeating our own stupid mistakes. If you talk about where they come from, though, I think in both cases, again, there were peculiar elements that were maybe a little bit different or unique to either Russia and Ukraine or to China. But the phrase is actually there, believe it or not, right in the manifesto of the Communist Party, the idea of industrial armies in the countryside. It's an evocative, but also a rather vague and suggestive phrase. What does it mean exactly? You're trying to catch up and surpass the West. And here's where the language is quite similar. When Stalin was launching not just the collectivization drive, but also the first five-year plan, usually conventionally dated to about 1928, although one of them was backdated a little bit later. He's talking about the need to catch up with and surpass the West, the idea that they have to almost telescope Russia's industrial development for 50 years, maybe into just 5 or 10 years. So you get these plans. So the idea is we're behind. We have to catch up and surpass the capitalist world. Mao was saying the same things in the late 50s. Oddly enough, Khrushchev was talking in similar ways about economic production, about things like milk and meat and even corn production. That is, that the Soviets, because of their superior planning, would actually overtake the West. And a large part of the Cold War competition really was, believe it or not, in this realm of perceived economic productivity, that the Soviets would outproduce the West. Mao said, well, we don't think we can catch up quite as quickly with the United States, but we will surpass Britain. So believe it or not, it's a combination of a phrase from the Manifesto of the Communist Party, the Stalinist example from collectivization, the first five-year plan, and then also this kind of almost yin and yang with Khrushchev promising to surpass the United States, and Mao wants to surpass Britain. This means somehow, in Mao's somewhat warped, xenophobic Marxist imagination, that means you have to radically overturn Chinese traditional agriculture and simultaneously industrialize and also collectivize agriculture involving hundreds of millions of peasants, which of course does not go well. I mean, everything from the famous backyard smelting furnaces for people's proverbial utensils that they were supposed to smelt in the backyard. I'm not sure what purpose that was supposed to serve, but it also meant that they no longer had the ability to eat at home, and so they would have to go into the communal mess halls, and so everyone would be kind of communized in every possible direction. It leads to, of course, chaos and famine. At least tens of millions, again, probably the best recent estimates, you're talking about 40 to 45 million people die in the Great Leap Forward. So what it came from a blend, a very strange and bizarre melange of ideas drawing from Marx and from Stalin, and even a little bit of competition, I think, with Khrushchev.
Professor Sean McMeekin, To Overthrow the World is the book. 1965, 1966, there's a rally in Tiananmen called by Mao to inspire students to destroy their teachers, their books, their learning, anyone with special knowledge, any professor. And I point out to this, Sean, I've done some lengthy reporting about the Red Guards. They're still alive. They remember themselves. They remember what they did, and they're ashamed of it. They talk about other people stealing from homes they broke into. They stole. And it went on for years. Well, it was chiefly over in 66, but it went on for years, brutality towards professors. And again, I'm looking for ideas. Mao meant this to happen, ostensibly because he was competing with younger members of the Politburo. I don't know. He tortured and beat up his own people, the Chinese communists, as well as people he didn't know. He turned them loose on the high school where he sent his children. Where are the ideas here? This looks like it's beyond anti-intellectualism. It's complete anarchy.
Well, there is a kind of madness to it, but there's also this, I think, sense of escalation. If you look at any of the communist regimes, there's always been something of a cult of the youth. That is, that it's only among the young that you can really instill the full ideas, that they will believe in the ideology. So the early years of communism in Russia, you couldn't trust people who'd been around in the old regime. You couldn't trust people over a certain age because they still remember the old holidays and the old traditions. And so eventually you got these organizations like the Pioneers or the Komsomol to instill the ideas in the youth. And there was a certain generational turnover in the Stalin years and the Great Terror with the purges, so you had a lot of the older figures purged and younger figures taking over. So some of this, I think, is inherent in the logic of a revolutionary regime, which is just constantly trying to replenish and renew itself. But in China, they obviously went further. It turned into this radical cult of youth that, again, Mao was using presumably for these instrumental purposes and party purges and maneuvering and trying to reinvigorate himself inside the party and to try to cut off maybe a new generation of rivals. But then it takes on a life of its own, and the Red Guards, you can't really control them. Eventually, even a lot of the Red Guards themselves were later sent out into the countryside. And so you had also this element of the overturning of urbane, literate civilization. That is, turning against education and books and turning against professors, turning against the elderly, turning against foreigners. We shouldn't forget there's a very xenophobic. A lot of foreign embassies were actually quite literally attacked. Even the Soviet embassy and the East German embassy were attacked. I mean, there are elements of this that are just seemingly mad. But then, of course, it inspires yet another movement in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, the Angkele, where they take this even further. And the cult of youth then shows them, I suppose, the path to arming pre-teenagers and young teens in order to overturn and overthrow all of existing society. Anarchy, I'm not sure is quite the right word. There's definitely an anarchic element to this. But in the end, I think it's the more nihilistic side, you might say, of communism, that you're not just overthrowing capitalism, you're not just overthrowing bourgeois civilization, you're not just purging any foreign element, any old element, anything that basically predated or pre-existing the revolution. If this logic, if you allow it to kind of keep pursuing itself to its absurd conclusion, then eventually you'll get something a little bit like this. That is, the young against the old, the destruction of everything which people value and treasure, which has taken years to build. Unfortunately, it's easy to destroy. It's much harder to build up again.
At this point, there is severe tension between Moscow and Beijing, and there's fear everywhere that it'll come to war, perhaps nuclear war. Does that enhance Mao's strength to regard Moscow as a revanchism, trying to take our lands away from us, or, Chinese nationalism? Does he use that?
Oh, he absolutely uses it. It's part of the general demonizing and scapegoating and searching for enemies. The Soviets become yet another enemy, and the Eastern Bloc, even some of those countries are targeted in the Cultural Revolution, such as East Germany, where the embassy is kind of picketed. The Americans, of course, are the great enemy for most of the 50s and 60s. Ironically, of course, it's then the Americans who decide to open up China. But it does allow Mao also to punch above his weight geopolitically. He can grandstand in a certain way where the Soviets no longer seem quite the same as far as the dynamism and the madcap energy. And he can even cultivate relations with renegade communist regimes, such as Ceausescu's in Romania. Ceausescu actually cozies up to Mao. And partly for that reason, and the peculiarities of American Cold War diplomacy, the U.S. opens up both Romania and China before they really open up to the Soviet Union. So I think it allows him to punch above his weight internationally, and it also gives him yet another useful cudgel with which to kind of browbeat and scapegoat his opponents inside China. That Soviet influence could be, for a time, just as bad, if not as pernicious, as American influence.
It always puzzled me that the Chinese Communist Party kept the language of the Soviets, of the Russians, of Marx. They kept the ideas, ostensibly kept the ideas from Europe, although they're xenophobic. They threw out everything else. Did that ever bother them? We have 30 seconds.
I'm not sure that it did. I think there's definitely an inferiority complex and this kind of notion of xenophobia and trying to purge everything from the West. I suppose Marx is an exception to this rule. I mean, this is something that people in Russia often have to debate these days too. They like to think that Marx and Marxism was somehow un-Russian. I would expect that in China this will happen someday, that Marx will be jettisoned along with all the other foreign baggage, but it hasn't happened yet.
Professor Sean McMeekin, his new book is To Overthrow the World, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Communism. It is 1956 in Moscow, and Nikita Khrushchev, who has emerged as the first among equals of the Politburo. Stalin is dead in March of 53. There's trouble with Beria, the secret police chief, and eventually the trouble is that he's complaining too much and he's murdered, executed, I believe is the polite way to put it, as a traitor. And Khrushchev becomes the center of interest outside and making a statement inside. And he makes something called the secret speech, which has, at this point, you'd have to say, was secret from no one because everybody immediately knew about it. And it rocked the Warsaw Pact in Eastern Europe that were all under the boot of the Soviets and had been since 1944-45 when they were overrun at the end of the war. So what we're looking at here is a temptation to break away from the absolute obedience to Moscow. It leads to disruption in Poland, in Germany, in Hungary eventually, all very badly damaged by their contradictions, yearning to be free, and then the Soviet armor shows up. But I want to go from what happens in the 1950s. I want to race ahead to first Berlin, and then the confrontation between the U.S. and Russia, the Soviets, over Cuba, because that was a temptation for the first time ever of a nuclear exchange. Washington believed it was coming. Moscow believed it was coming. Sean, here's the puzzle about the Soviet Union. I can't find Marx anywhere here. This looks like straight power politics between imperial powers. Is that how to read it?
Well, if you're talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think you could definitely see an element of just raw traditional great power politics. But the impetus behind it, that is to say, why, despite supposedly unearthing the crimes under Stalin and the secret speech and thawing out at least a little bit of Soviet culture so that, for example, Solzhenitsyn's A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich is allowed to be published. There's a little bit of discussion of some of the crimes, at least those committed against the party, in the Stalin years. Why then does Khrushchev carry out this act of brinkmanship? I mean, some of it was just opportunism. I think the opportunity fell into Khrushchev's lap. Initially, Castro himself was not actually really a doctrinaire communist. His brother Raoul was. Castro himself was not even necessarily viewed as a client until he more or less begged to become one. And then the Soviets just took this opportunity. And they were really trying to reverse, I think, the strategic balance of the time. The U.S. had, despite what Kennedy had campaigned on in 1960, the U.S. actually had a pretty clear superiority in intercontinental ballistic missiles, and the Soviets, by stationing these shorter range missiles in Cuba, could really overturn the balance. In the end, of course, a deal is struck involving some of the missiles that the United States had in Turkey. You're right that as far as the confrontation between the U.S. and Russia, despite some of the more colorful and baroque elements, the space race, and even things like the Tchaikovsky competition in Moscow, and these strange arguments about who's going to outproduce the other in terms of meat and milk. There are elements of this that are seemingly absurd, or as you might say, simply about great power rivalry. But of course, what's driving it from the Soviet side, that is, they really are trying to prove that they have a superior system. And it's kind of amazing, but for the longest time in the 60s and 70s, a lot of American policymakers, particularly in Langley, Virginia, and the CIA, actually believed them. They really thought the Soviets were going to surpass the West, that there was this superior variety of economic planning that in the end would produce greater economic growth and perhaps a greater bounty and at the very least a superior nuclear arsenal. And the Soviets actually do pretty well in at least in the realm of weapons in the arms race. The Soviets actually do achieve an edge by the mid 1970s. It's kind of thin. It's not drastically superior. But in the end, I suppose the line that people said in retrospect, the Soviets were upper volta with rockets, that their economy was in the end inferior. But that's not what people thought back in the 1670s. If you actually revisit that, really, right into the 1980s, I think most of the policymakers in Washington thought that the United States was losing the Cold War.
Yes, we come to this magic moment somewhere between 1970 and 1980. There was a perception that the Soviet Union was normal, that Leninist Marxism was just a competing brand of ideology to be acknowledged, and not to look very hard at the mass murder that it had built its reputation upon. And this is the time of so-called détente between the nuclear power of the United States and the nuclear power of the Soviet Union. That conversation begins out of Vietnam, but it's the effort of the American counselors to separate China and Russia and to go to China, as Mr. Nixon does in 1972, and to make inroads into the war between Moscow and Washington. One of those inroads was in space, as the professor mentions, the Apollo Soyuz mission of 1975. That's détente. The Soviets are doing very well, and we come to an ironic moment that you feature in your reporting, Sean, that I loved, how in 1979, the Politburo all agreed with Andropov at the table. I believe Brezhnev might have been there as well. We should not do anything violent about Afghanistan. And then what? 8 months later, they do something violent about Afghanistan. How do we remember that now? What made them throw away all the achievements they'd put together for the last 10 years for Afghanistan?
It is rather remarkable to see the Soviets making such a similar mistake to the one the United States had arguably made in getting sucked into Vietnam and Indochina. That at least Andropov, head of the KGB, and some of the other members of the Politburo, I think, saw quite clearly the dangers, and they realized they were kind of wise and old cynics, and they realized that there was no real demand for Marxist communism in Afghanistan, that outside the main towns, the people were still quite tribal, and obviously Islam still had purchase to the extent that tribalism didn't. I think they understood that perfectly well, but in the end it turned into one of those pride things where their client was killed, and so they had to seek vengeance. And so they did. They got sucked and they got drawn in, and it turned out to be this tremendous opportunity for the United States to turn the tables. So, you're talking about hard power. Obviously, a lot of this was hard power. The United States getting arms to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, Reagan ramping up the conventional arms buildup in the 1980s, leaning on Saudi Arabia to basically unleash this kind of spare production capacity and flood the market so that the oil price, which the Soviets were increasingly dependent on for a lot of their hard currency income, all of these kind of hard power elements put huge pressure on the Soviet Union. They're very different from détente and Ostpolitik, which had all been the other direction, all ways of kind of easing up on the Soviets and allowing them access to Western loans and easing up the pressure and really allowing the Soviets, frankly, to kind of surpass the U.S. and its allies for a while in the 1970s in the arms race. The 1980s was one of confrontation. Now, I don't think it necessarily had to lead to the fall of the Soviet Union. I think it did lead, of course, Gorbachev to try to reinvigorate Soviet communism. We forget this. We think about Gorbachev kind of in retrospect as something of a pacifist or a peacemaker who wanted to surrender the Cold War, at the very least was willing to dial down the competition. But of course, that's not what he was trying to do when he came to power in 1985. He was launching a new 5-year plan, which is all about ramping up military production targets, and everything from ICBMs to tanks, nuclear submarines, even biological weapons. The Soviets were actually ramping up expenditure on arms in the 1980s. Just in the end, this expenditure bankrupted the Soviet Union. And so in the end, I think it was predominantly an economic failure. There were definitely some strategic and political elements involved in Gorbachev, I think, misreading the political and international situation. But it was absolutely this kind of budgetary pressure placed on the Soviets by the Cold War and the arms race. And Gorbachev's effort to reinvigorate Soviet communism is, I think, in the end, what killed the sick patient.
I'm glad you bring up Mikhail Gorbachev because he emphasized when he joined the Politburo, and his biography validates the fact that he was a very close reader of Lenin and Marx. He read the nobody reads them, but he did, and he studied them. And his idea was to turn the Soviets away from their big power conduct and back to the original vision that he believed was in Marx and Lenin. Did anybody listen to him?
Well, Gorbachev certainly thought that communism could work. He wanted to clean it up a bit. He wanted to have higher production standards and qualities. So there was even a kind of almost quasi-prohibition. He wanted people to drink less. He wanted to get rid of the corruption, which, frankly, was part of what allowed the system to work at all. I think that's the part he really didn't understand. He actually wanted them to plan better and to have more intelligent state bureaucracy and more intelligent planning. And there were even going to be more planning ministries. It's just they were going to do a better job of it, and they would have quality control and certain collectives which would be a little bit more ground up, and certain accountability of the managers. He was absolutely trying to reinvigorate communism. In that sense, he was arguably the last true believing communist in the Soviet Union, or at least one of the last of them. I think what he didn't understand was that without the corruption, really, I think the economy really wouldn't have been working at all. He understood that there were problems. He just didn't really understand how to fix them. He was kind of a Don Quixote tilting at windmills when it came to economic reform. And he also misunderstood, and this is where I think Deng Xiaoping was just a better politician, or you might say a more effective statesman, was that in the end, the system really did require force to keep it together. In the end, you absolutely had to have the security organs with a firm control of course, the capital cities and critical choke points of the country as a whole. I think in the end, Gorbachev really didn't understand that the regime he was running was not really popular. In the end, it rested on force.
I'm speaking with Professor Sean McMeekin. To overthrow the world, the rise and fall and rise of communism. Remember that formula. Marxist Leninists, whether they've read the books or not, depend upon extreme violence to come into power and depend upon violence to stay in power. Several hours ago, talking about the violence visited upon the students in Tiananmen in 1989 that is banished from even conversation on Chinese media today. However, 1989 was a year in which a lot of shibboleths fell away. The Berlin story. And I go to Romania because there was a couple there named the Ceausescus who had practiced violence against their own people for years. Romania remains poor these decades later, but it was extremely poor at the time, despite the fact that it opened up enough to welcome Richard Nixon at one point in the 1970s. However, the Ceausescus stayed in power with violence until they killed too many or something happened, and the people pushed back hard. And the Ceausescus were executed ignominiously as they were trying to escape or as people had just abducted them. The Ceausescus were dead, and the professor makes the point, and the Ceausescus are an illustration, that the communist regimes did not fall because of a rising from the bottom. Did not. And that was the original understanding, my reading of the 19th century socialists and Marxists and communists. They believed the communard would change the world. And Professor, do we say they're wrong or they didn't have enough information at the time?
Well, I think they're wrong in most cases. I suppose the only really happy story of 1989 where you can kind of see this element of popular protest and a regime more or less just bowing down before a popular protest is the so-called Velvet Revolution in Prague, or you could maybe say this about the fall of the Berlin Wall. But I think in the really important cases, it was the disappearance of coercion that really counted the most. In the end, it was Gorbachev's decision effectively to let the satellites go, and that was even announced by Gerasimov in an interview with American television, in fact, when he said that the Brezhnev doctrine, this is basically that the Soviets would fight to maintain communist regimes wherever they existed, was now replaced by what he somewhat charmingly called the Sinatra doctrine, that they were free to go my way. Now, they didn't all just go my way, rather, the security organs either disintegrated in some cases, they weren't strong enough without Soviet help in other cases. In the case of Romania, you basically had a kind of an inside palace coup, various factions from the Communist Party overthrowing the Ceausescu and other factions in the Communist Party. So you had a version of this across Eastern Europe. That is to say, for the most part, a good example of is Milosevic in the former Yugoslavia, where you have these party apparatchiks who just reinvent themselves, perhaps as revanchist nationalists, or perhaps they just kind of change the label of the party, as they would eventually do in Romania and Bulgaria and some of these other countries. Now, Germany was a little bit different because, of course, you had the example next door of a relatively free capitalist West Germany, which in the end had not just the kind of legitimacy, but also the money to basically absorb East Germany and really spent a lot of money over the next couple of decades trying to open up its economy. But in nearly every case, it was, as I think you rightly pointed out, rather a top-down business. So that even in Russia, with the famous image of Yeltsin on the tank and the popular crowds in Moscow, effectively it was a kind of a mutiny where the armed forces lined up beside Yeltsin, who, of course, himself was a party apparatchik and a lifelong communist, instead of behind Gorbachev. So that it was a sort of a mutiny, a sort of a coup. And in the end, Yeltsin, of course, jettisoned communism. And curiously, they even had a trial because Yeltsin tried to abolish the Communist Party, but the Communist Party sued him. And a lot of people forget this part of the story, but the Communist Party actually won that lawsuit to be reinstated as a legal political party in Russia, which, of course, it still is to this day.
Yes, to this day. A colonel in the KGB is president of Russia 3 times now and perhaps the balance of his life. I do not see any Marxist-Leninism whatsoever in the publications of Moscow. Is there anything in there that is other than Imperial Russia, Professor?
Well, there are different elements, I think, in today's Russia. You pointed out, obviously, the KGB past, the so-called Siloviki or security organs that have surrounded Putin from the start. There's certainly an element of kind of nostalgia for some of the Soviet period, at the very least, the military achievements and the victory over the Soviet Union, which is a huge part of the regime's kind of narrative about itself today. They've definitely jettisoned Lenin. I mean, there's a curious thing about the modern Russian political landscape is that Lenin has almost no purchase left, whereas Stalin actually does. Stalin actually still is seen as something of, at the very least, he was a builder. Maybe Lenin was a destroyer and Stalin was a conqueror and a builder. Not that people want to go back to the terror years or to collectivization or to 5-year plans, but as far as helping to legitimize the regime and the story that it tells about itself, I think there's definitely this element where they are trying to draw on the Stalinist and Soviet legacy. I mean, there was even this famous example from I believe it was the 2004 presidential campaign where the Putin team united Russia. They put up these posters of both Solzhenitsyn, one of the most famous Soviet dissidents, and Stalin. So they could kind of claim both as part of the Russian story, which led up to today. So there's an element of it, I suppose you might say, of kind of paradox or irony. But certainly as far as the statism, you could definitely see that a very strong state, control of the media. Some of these elements would not have been out of place in the communist era. It's a little bit softer now. It's not quite as aggressive. It's not quite as ubiquitous. On the other hand, in some ways, I think it's actually stronger. That is, the statist control, the censorship, the control of the information space than it was, for example, under the Tsars. So there's a kind of hybrid state capitalist with certain elements of nostalgia for communism. And lately, unfortunately, because of the confrontation with the United States in Ukraine and elsewhere, there are also these elements of a kind of xenophobia and anti-Americanism, I think, in the political rhetoric and the kind of political landscape of Russia, again, some of which draws on old communist tropes. But it's certainly not full communism or even the communist tyranny of the kind that we see in today's China.
We have a minute, Professor, and you have convinced me, having very carefully gone through your case, that violence, extreme violence, is the predicate for the socialist, Marxist, Leninist, anarchist vision of the world. Was that a revelation to you, Sean, or did you know beforehand? We have a minute.
I think I had an idea of it, but it was really when I went back to the original text that I saw just how central it was to the project. And it absolutely has been central up to the current day. I think the only thing that I would say that might be a little bit of a cautionary tale for today or moving forward is that I think we've now discovered with the varieties of social credit and state surveillance that are practiced in China today, some of which we've begun to see, unfortunately, in the West, is that modern technology technology has, I think, made it possible to control the population without quite such an extreme degree of political violence. And so I think that's something we're going to have to keep our eyes on moving forward.
Professor Sean McMeekin, his new book is To Overthrow the World, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Communism. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.